obvious non-visible minority, I was very struck by a comment from James Baldwin, who said that white people are trapped in history that they don't understand. It occurs to me that maybe all of us here in the room, are unaware about one another's histories and how much we could benefit from knowing about one another, where we came from, what our heritage is. I thought I'd just give you a little bit of Irish history. I came across an article called The Black Irish of Jamaica. I was amazed by, oh great, you know, I just learned to Google. I mean, I've only been on the net for a year, so you have to, so here I'm Googling away, The Black Irish of Jamaica, wonderful article. And it talked all about the Irish experience in the Caribbean. I spoke to a lot of my African Caribbean friends. Oh yeah, the Irish were our overseers. They were the slave masters, they came over, they were in charge of us. And I delved a bit deeper, and I found out actually that the Irish were the first slaves that were ever used by the British slavery system. They transported whole villages across the Caribbean, men, women and children, bound up in cattle trucks down to the harbour, transported them across as forced labour. So we have a shared experience, of slavery. I then came across another really good article where white privilege came from, Alan Johnson, and he talks about the long history of the British struggle to conquer Ireland and subjugate its people. This structured relation of dominance, along with British frustration in the face of stubborn resistance, gives rise to a cultural belief that the Irish were an inferior and savage people, not merely in the organisation of their societies, but in their very nature as human beings. The British came to view the Irish as something like a separate species altogether, possessing inferior traits that were biologically passed from one generation to the next. In this, the British were inventing a concept of race that made it a path of least resistance to see other peoples as subhuman, if not non-human, making it easier to objectify them and more difficult to feel empathy for them as members of their own kind. When the British came to North America, they brought with them both cultural views of race and the expectations of their own position of dominance as a structural feature of any society they might establish. It's important to emphasise that prior to the British experience with the Irish and the enslavement of Africans in North America, the concept of race, including categories such as white and colour as social markers of inferiority and superiority, did not exist. Notice then how cultural ideas can come into being as a way to justify structural arrangements, and how those same ideas can go on to play a role in shaping other systems in various ways, such as the subordinations of Africans and Native Americans when English migrants came to North America to make new lives for themselves. So most of us here today, or many of us, are migrants or descendants of migrants. So we have the experience of racism firmly embedded in our consciousness and in our race memory. And for me, the memory of that notice in the 50s and the 60s, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. It's here in my heart. The experience of being welcomed for our labour and exploited for it, but despised and oppressed in terms of belonging and thriving and succeeding. For even though some of us have profited in our host countries, albeit often on the backs of our own or people like us, the experience of invisibility and hostility, of being unwanted and unloved, has been one of heartbreak, disenfranchisement and disillusionment. We aspire to move towards the distant horizon of the post-racial or post-racist society. There are still many miles to travel, dear friends. We've got to hack out new paths and new ways to travel. In the building of, and to quote Matthew, an informed citizenry and more unified communities, it is essential to consider how we meet together as humans to share our fears, hopes and experiences. And as someone who's worked most of my life on the idea of creating spaces and dialogues which involve the experiences from the margins of lives, I'm indeed delighted to read in Matthew's writings about the need to create spaces where people feel protected, where they feel comfortable enough to be vulnerable and not attacked by somebody who disagrees with them, where people can go and not be shouted down. In the building of such welcoming communities, we have to cross the invisible borders that separate and differentiate our humanities, and be fully prepared to trust in the power of opening up our hearts to one another and saying, you are truly welcome here, my brothers and sisters. And surely it's my great pleasure here to extend a warmth of such a welcome to our guest, Matthew Whittaker. And so in the best Irish tradition, Matthew, come right on in and take a seat by the fire.